This unit deals with the bureaucracy, that is to say, the agencies of government that actually perform functions. A formal definition of bureaucracy is that it's a large organization that is structured in a hierarchical fashion to carry out very specific functions. If you've ever had sociology, you're probably familiar with Max Weber. He's one of the primary leaders of the field. He defined a bureaucratic organization as hierarchical, that is, there's a clear chain of command. It has specialized expertise and knowledge of how to administer particular programs, and it applies the rules impersonally to all individuals according to the rules and regulations that are spelled out. Now, what kinds of agencies are there? The cabinet agencies, the independent agencies, the regulatory agencies, quasi-governmental corporations, and quasi-official agencies. These are relatively limited. Let's talk about each kind. Cabinet agencies are established by Congress and given cabinet-level rank by Congress. The executives are appointed by the President and approved by the Senate, and they may be organized into sub-agencies such as bureaus, services, offices, and the like. If you're interested, you can go to the whitehouse.gov website and take a look at the cabinet agencies. Altogether, there are some 15 now. The Big Four were created: Treasury, State, Defense, War actually, and Justice were created in 1789. It was a while before Interior was added, long after the Louisiana Purchase, and it was clear that somebody had to have the responsibility to take care of this newly acquired land. In 1862, the Department of Agriculture was created, and it was created with a political purpose in mind. As the country moved west onto the Great Plains, it became obvious that there was a real problem with the ability to be able to farm out in the far western part of the world. It was a different world. So agriculture was committed. Now, part of the reason it was political was to get free farmers rather than slave farmers out to conquer the plains during the Civil War. So regardless of how the Civil War came out, the West was going to be free. As the country industrialized, a Department of Commerce and Labor was established, but it became obvious that these were not good in the same agency, so the Departments of Commerce and Labor were created as splits. Health and Human Services was first created in 1953 as Health, Education, and Welfare, but then it was split out in 1979 for Education as a separate agency. Housing and Urban Development, 1965, Transportation, 66, Energy, 77, Veterans Affairs had actually been created as an independent agency in 1862 to take care of the soldiers who had been injured or damaged in the Civil War. The War Department didn't feel that they were able to do that, but it was raised to cabinet-level rank in 1989. After 9/11, the Department of Homeland Security was created to merge different bureaus of different agencies that all dealt with Homeland but had not integrated their efforts, and to some extent that was considered to have led to 9/11. Independent agencies are created by Congress, given their role, scope, and authority. They do not have cabinet-level rank, but their presidents, their heads are appointed by the President, approved by the Senate. Some examples: the General Services Administration, the National Science Foundation, and NASA. Regulatory agencies started out being governed by multi-member boards that had overlapping terms that were nonpartisan. The board members were appointed by the Senate, and approved by the Senate, and may actually be appointed now by a single-headed executive, such as the Environmental Protection Agency. If we had time, we could go into a long discussion of how the theory that the boards really weren't working that well. The key thing is they have rule-making authority, so they can make rules. Some examples: Federal Communications Commission, the Federal Trade Commission, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the National Labor Relations Board, the Federal Election Commission. Government corporations are businesses created by the government, and are generally self-supporting. They have an appointed, overlapping membership, nonpartisan board. The largest of these, without any question, is the U.S. Postal Service. Conrail, Comsat, the Communications Satellite Corporation, TVA. You can look at each of these and see what they do. They have some interesting websites. And then you have sort of just boards, commissions, and committees that are created generally on some sort of a temporary basis, but somehow those temporary bases don't always necessarily end up being totally temporary. I think it's fun to look at this list and look at things like the Arctic Research Commission, the Citizens Stamp Advisory Committee, etc. And then we have a batch of quasi-official agencies that are not really and truly governmental agencies, but have one foot in each area. Biggest example of that would be the Smithsonian Institution, and you can go to that and take a look at it. Now, political scientists who study the bureaucracy talk about iron triangles. These are the relationship between interest groups, the bureaus, and the congressional subcommittees. These are people who are concerned with particular issues at a particular time, and the general public is generally not too concerned with it. One of the basic problems that came up early in the game was a spoil system, patronage, where appointments were made to reward loyal supporters. Other qualifications were pretty much secondary. And what was important was your patron staying in office, because if they didn't, you would lose your job. One of the major reforms to come about was the adoption of the Civil Service Act in 1883, where the appointments would be made on the basis of how capable a person was to perform the work. And this was a part of the program by Chester A. Arthur. Now, Chester A. Arthur assumed the presidency upon the assassination of President Garfield, and having directed the spoils operation in the state of New York, everyone had real doubts about whether Chester A. Arthur would be a good enough president, but he surprised everybody by supporting the civil service reforms. Now, the elements of the civil service system are job classification, where we know what the job is all about, a standard wage scale, competitive examinations, a due process so that people are not fired without having some degree of job protection, and requirement that they stay non-political, they stay out of elections. Now, there are exceptions to those competitive examinations, department heads, and Schedule C appointments. Also, people who have specialized or technical skills that you really don't want to attempt to test. For example, a surgeon in the Veterans Administration who's licensed to practice medicine doesn't have to pass another test. Now, in 1978, there was a major civil service reform which relaxed the firing and discipline rules and established the senior executive service, which theoretically was going to allow bureaucrats to be transferred from one office to another agency to utilize executive talent. If we had lots of time, we could discuss this in great detail. There have been a lot of efforts to try to modernize bureaucracy. Sunshine laws, which open it up so that people can see what's going on. In Texas, we call them open records laws. Sunset laws, which take agencies that are not performing the way they should and lose them or close them down. Contracting with private agencies to perform functions rather than having the government do it. Providing bonuses and incentives for extraordinary work. And then the whistleblowers' protection to protect whistleblowers who point out in corruption or point out inefficiency. Now, what are the tasks for a bureaucracy? Well, they have to implement the laws that Congress has passed. They have to administer the laws that Congress has passed, and frequently they also have a job of creating regulations. Implementation involves providing the expertise necessary to make the law work. Administration, the routine task performing to make sure that the policies are carried out. And then regulation. Food and Drug Administration. Congress passes a broad general legislative act. They have the responsibility of applying it and making it work. The Federal Communications Commission issues licenses for people to use airwaves. Now, what are some of the constraints on the bureaucracy? First off, they got to work within a budget. And no matter how efficient they are, they're not allowed to keep the money from one financial year and carry it over to the next. Many of the decisions about hiring, purchasing, contracting, budgeting have to be made following the rules of Congress, and the goals of the agency are established by Congress and the President, not by the people who run the agency. The President can appoint people, he can reorganize agencies, he has great control over the budget, and he can attempt to persuade. Congress, of course, creates and can abolish. They appropriate the funds, and they can exercise administrative oversight. Sometimes they can investigate, hold hearings, and review. Well, everybody's not happy with the way the bureaucracy works. Some would like to go back to the patronage system. Others constantly talk about reforming the civil service system. Others want to broaden the whistle power. There is much push pressure, particularly from companies outside of government, for government to turn over governmental functions to private businesses, and then we have the sunshine, open records, or sunset laws, and various whistleblower laws. I hope this brief but overview of bureaucracy is helpful to you.